The Louisiana Purchase and the Lewis and Clark Expedition. Please remember, as you listen to the movie, to pause whenever you need to and rewind the movie whenever you have to. Your target for this lesson is, I can summarize one important fact from the Louisiana Purchase and two important facts from the Lewis and Clark Expedition. President Jefferson buys Louisiana. Here are some of the facts. 828,000 acres of land, roughly, made up the Louisiana Territory that France sold to the United States for $15 million total. If you do the math on that, that equals about 3 cents per acre. The purchase more than doubled the size of the United States at that time. That's important because, as we all know, land equals money, money equals power. Lastly, the United States got control of the city of New Orleans and the Mississippi River in this deal. Now, some of the details behind that. Napoleon Bonaparte, which you may or may not have ever heard of him before, was the leader of France at this time. He sold America the Louisiana Territory for that $15 million. Now, he was a smart, cagey kind of guy, and he knew that Americans would move into the Louisiana Territory eventually, whether it was part of America or not, and there was nothing that France could do about it. So he decided to sell it to America because they were going to take it anyway, but at least if they sold it to America, France would get the $15 million. Well, France needed money because it was in a continuous fight, wars, plural, many, with England. And that 15 million US dollars would buy a lot of bullets for the French army. Finally, Napoleon knew that America would use all that land and get very strong, and that if America got very strong, it would eventually challenge England. And England was France's most hated enemy. Napoleon had a quote from when he sold this land: "I have given England a rival who sooner or later will humble their pride." A few years after this, America and England did go to war, the War of 1812, and America won. So Napoleon was right, and he got $15 million, and got rid of some land that he couldn't use anyway. The purchase of Louisiana doubles the size of the United States. That's the second time I've said that. There's a reason for that. It's going to be on your test. It's going to be on quizzes. You need to know that it doubled the size of the United States. Now, the United States also gains control of the largest river in North America, which is the Mississippi River. The Mississippi River carried an enormous amount of farm goods from the western, at that time, western United States. Indiana, Kentucky, Tennessee. So there's lots and lots of farm products going down the Mississippi River into what used to be French land, but now it's American land, and it ends up at the city of New Orleans, right here at the bottom of the Mississippi River, and that's where it gets loaded on big ocean-going ships for its trips to Europe and everywhere else around the world. So that was a very, very important part of this purchase.
At the time, the great powers of the world could only guess what existed in the uncharted West. Native Americans already called this land home, but other nations hoped for a wealth of natural riches and had staked competing claims. Britain to Canada and the Oregon Country, Russia the Pacific Northwest, Spain the West and parts of the South, France an immense tract called Louisiana. By sending an expedition into foreign land, Thomas Jefferson hoped to open the West up for the United States In 1803, a surprise. Napoleon offered to sell the entire Louisiana Territory. The U.S. quickly purchased it for $15 million, more than doubling the size of the nation.
Now, not everybody was in favor of the purchase of Louisiana. There were questions at the very beginning if the President of the United States, President Jefferson, even had the power to purchase the land. There were also people who were against President Jefferson because he was in the Democratic Republican Party, and the other party was called the Federalists back then. The Federalists hated Jefferson, and members of the Federalist Party were very unhappy about this. This is a quote from page 101 of this very good book on Lewis and Clark and the Louisiana Purchase, and it talks about some Federalists in Boston and what they felt about this. So I will read it to you. But a Boston Federalist newspaper did not like the deal at all. It called Louisiana, quote, a great waste, a wilderness unpeopled with any beings except wolves and wandering Indians. We are to give money, which we have too little, for land, which we already have too much. End quote. Jefferson was risking national bankruptcy to buy what could have been a desert. So as you can see, not everyone was thrilled with this purchase. Now, the purchase did go through. We did get the land. But then the next question is, what's actually in Louisiana? Nobody had been there. The only people that had been there are Native Americans, and they weren't telling us what was there. So, President Jefferson sent two captains, Captain Lewis and Captain Clark, to explore, hint for quizzes, the land, and to, hint for quizzes, map the new land. Those are two important things that you need to know about Lewis and Clark. Now, Lewis was actually very close friends with President Jefferson. That's why he got chosen. And then Lewis picked an old army friend of his, Clark, to lead the expedition. There were other people in the expedition, but it's always known as Lewis and Clark's expedition because these two guys were the leaders. Now, some other things. There were rumors about what America had purchased in Louisiana, but since no one had been there, there were some pretty crazy ideas out there. Like one idea that the land out in Louisiana was inhabited by dinosaurs and dragons and other exotic animals. There were other ideas that were much less far-fetched. One of them was that the Missouri River, which eventually drained into the Atlantic Ocean, actually started on a small hill only a few miles from the Pacific Ocean. And a short, simple canal or tunnel could connect the two oceans. And the dream to make travel between Europe and Asia faster and safer would come true. Now remember, thinking back to earlier in 7th grade, that was the same dream that Christopher Columbus had, that you could get in a boat and sail from Europe to Asia without getting off your boat. Could you do that by sailing across the Atlantic Ocean, up the Mississippi River, up the Missouri River, maybe get into a canal, go through a little tunnel, and then on the other side pop out, and there's the Pacific Ocean, and keep right on going all the way to China, Japan, India, places like that? That was the possibility. Who knew what was going on? So in short, the question was, what did we get when we bought Louisiana?
To cross this unknown land would be among the most ambitious and difficult journeys ever conceived. Clark wrote in his journal,
"All in health and readiness to set out, boats and everything complete with the necessary stores of provisions, though not as much as I think necessary for the multitude of Indians through which we must pass."
They pushed off upstream from St. Louis, young American soldiers and French-Canadian rivermen handpicked for strength and wilderness skills. Among them, a man named York, Clark's slave and companion since childhood. All were leaving their families behind for years.
This map shows the route that Lewis and Clark took on their journey to the Pacific Ocean. They started off in St. Louis and sailed and walked and pushed their boats up the Missouri River. These words right here, these are the native tribes that they passed as they went through, and the Sioux were really the only native tribe that they had trouble with. There was no shooting and fighting, but it was a very intense situation for a while. They spent the winter at Fort Mandan, and then they actually split up here at the top of the Missouri River, and Clark went in one direction, Lewis went in another, and they met up here at a place called Three Forks. They then went across what is now known as the Rocky Mountains, where they needed to get horses and things, and they met several more tribes, the Shoshone tribe, the Nez Perce tribe, which we'll talk about here in a little bit, and then they get all the way to the Pacific Ocean after sailing down the Columbia River, and they see the Pacific Ocean. So they had actually gone from the Mississippi, which empties into the Atlantic, into the Pacific. Now, at Fort Clatsop, there was a pretty historic vote. They got to Fort Clatsop. It was winter. It was getting colder. They knew that they couldn't go all the way back across the Rocky Mountains and back to America in the time they had left. They had to stay here. But where to stay? That was a question. If they stayed at the very end of the Columbia River, where the river empties into the Pacific Ocean, they had a okay chance of seeing ships that would go by, and they might be able to hop a ride all the way back down and around and get back to America. That was a possibility, but the area right there at the end of the river did not have good campgrounds, it didn't have good food, it didn't have good water, but you did have the possibility of seeing a ship going by. Farther back up the river, a few miles, there was better land, much better food, better water, but you couldn't see the ocean. You couldn't see any ships going by. So this decision of where to camp for the winter was put to a vote. And everybody, and I mean everybody in Lewis and Clark's expedition was able to vote. Why is this important? Well, way back here, Lewis and Clark had picked up a native guide, a woman by the name of Sacagawea. She knew the languages of the different native tribes in through here, and actually she met her brother on the way back through. So she was with them during this vote at Fort Clatsop, and also Lewis's slave by the name of York was with them, and he was allowed to vote also. So everybody voted. The white men, African American slave was allowed to vote, and a Native American woman was allowed to vote. And it's important because that's the first time in American history that you see African Americans and women, especially Native American women, being able to vote in what would eventually become the United States. And that was on November 26, 1805. Finally, what did they find? Well, they met many, many native tribes. Probably the most notable were the Nez Perce, who were extremely friendly to them. That was in this area over here. And the Nez Perce were the ones that when Lewis and Clark were desperate, they'd been walking, it was wintertime, it was snowing, they had to cross the Rocky Mountains that looked like they were at the end of their journey that they would end up dying in the top of these mountains with no food and not getting to the Pacific Ocean, the Nez Perce gave them horses, gave them food, allowed them to continue their travels to get all the way to the Pacific Ocean. So that was important. Plants. Many, many, many types of plants and plant samples were found and discovered, boxed up and shipped all the way back down the Missouri River, and eventually ended up in President Jefferson's house in Monticello in Virginia. President Jefferson was very, very interested in the science of plants and botany and biology and all the different new plants that were out there. Also, animals. There were many types of animals that were found out in the Louisiana territory that were not around, that were unknown to the rest of the United States. One cute one, prairie dogs. You know, funny little creatures with their, popping their heads up, and they look cute, and there's a whole, bunches of them all over the place. They're furry, they're cute, they're lovable, and not dangerous at all, very harmless. Other animals that were unknown, but were very harmful, grizzly bears. The first time that the Lewis and Clark expedition ran into grizzly bears, they assumed that they were like the black bears and brown bears in the eastern part of the United States that are afraid of people. It was a rude awakening when they came across the grizzly bear, and the grizzly bear was not in any way, shape, or form afraid of people, number one. Did not see people as something to be afraid of, but as something to eat. And the grizzly bears were intensely aggressive. So a grizzly bear, when it sees a human, would run after it and eat them, rather than run away from them being scared, which is even more terrifying when you realize that, yes, the men in Lewis and Clark's expedition had guns, but their guns loaded very, very slowly, and the bullets were very, very inaccurate, and it usually took 3 or 4 bullets to actually stop a grizzly bear. So meeting a grizzly bear, very, very intense and unhappy situation. So that was some of the unknown animals that they found. That also wraps up Lewis and Clark's journey through the Louisiana territory that was purchased for $15 million from France by the United States. Make sure that you have everything all filled out. Again, I just want to remind you that you can go through and replay all or any part of this movie to fill out anything on your note sheet that you still need help with. Thank you. Your target for this lesson is, I can summarize one important fact from the Louisiana Purchase and 2 important facts from the Lewis and Clark expedition.